Chapter 5: A Long and Hungry War. Once it was clear to both sides that they were in a real fight, one that was not simply going to fade away, some important steps had to be taken. First, many more soldiers would be needed. Second, the ragtag amateur soldiers would have to be better trained. And third, somehow, enough supplies and arms had to be found to keep the soldiers in the field. The first two needs were reasonably easy to address. Before the first year of fighting was over, both the Union and Confederate governments issued calls for massive numbers of enlistments. These would not be 90-day enlistments. The new soldiers would be signing on for 3 years. An estimated 2,898,304 would serve in the Union Army during the war, while the Confederate side would see almost 1,500,000 join. Creating good soldiers began with the officers. Many men had become officers through political favoritism, or because they had been able to sign up enough recruits to make a regiment. Others were elected by soldiers themselves, usually because they were popular, easygoing fellows. Such officers did not know how to handle groups of men during battle and never earned their respect either. The Union moved quickly to weed out these weak officers. Military boards were set up to examine officers, and over the next few months, hundreds of officers were discharged or resigned. This did not put a complete end to the practice of appointing or electing officers, but it did establish some minimum standards for competence. As noted before, the South seemed to have gotten a better crop of officers from the start. Why did this happen? One reason is that of the 8 military schools the country had in 1860, 7 were located in the South. Generally, officers remained loyal to the regions where they were trained. Of the 1,900 men who had attended Virginia Military Academy, over 1,750 would serve the South. This does not mean that every officer in the Confederate Army was a seasoned veteran. One very young officer wrote, "While here at Taylorsville we have daily evening battalion drills, of which I know nothing in the world. In vain do I take Harder's tactics in hand and try to study out the maneuvers." It was not at all unusual to see large formations of soldiers being drilled by an officer with his manual of instructions firmly in hand. But as the officers learned their duties, so did the soldiers. The one problem neither side quite solved was how to supply their troops with enough food. A few statistics will show the immense size of the problem faced by each side. An army of 100,000 soldiers required 2,500 supply wagons and at least 35,000 horses and mules for use by the cavalry and to haul the wagons and artillery. Men and horses consumed 600 tons of supplies every day. Food had to be gathered from various growing regions and then shipped hundreds of miles by train to supply bases. Then it had to be loaded into wagons and brought to the troops in the field. As these full wagons were moving in, empty wagons had to be on the way back to the supply depots to load up the next day's supplies. All of this movement had to be timed and carried out with precision if soldiers were going to be fed on time. After a fumbling first year, both the Union and Confederate armies managed to organize and coordinate their supply efforts. And they worked reasonably well for the most part. Young Thomas Galway seemed pleased with his rations. The food issued to soldiers is very good and in ample quantity. It consists of salt pork or fresh beef, soft bread baked in field ovens, and hardtack on the march and in campaign, coffee and sugar. For vegetables, desiccated potatoes, mixed desiccated vegetables for soup, and bean, rice, and onions. Besides these, we can buy from the sutler all sorts of delicacies such as oysters, canned fruit, cheese, raisins, tobacco, and last though not least, whiskey. But the food supply system was a delicate ballet of movement that could be distributed by any one of a number of things. Spring rains might turn the dirt road into a quagmire of mud that could delay wagons for several days. A sudden movement of troops might put them in an area without adequate roads, cutting them off from supplies for days or weeks. One 16-year-old soldier from New York, Charles Knott, tells about his regiment's troubles during a particularly cold winter. Again, we sat down beside the campfire for supper. It consisted of hard pilot bread, raw pork, and coffee. the coffee you probably would not recognize in New York, boiled in an open kettle and about the color of a brownstone front. It was nevertheless the only warm thing we had. The pork was frozen, and the water in the canteens solid ice, so we had to hold them over the fire when we wanted a drink. No one had plates or spoons, knives or forks, cups or saucers. We cut off the frozen pork with our pocket knives, and one tin cup from which each man took a drink in turn served the coffee. Another common complaint among soldiers was that the food they did get was almost always the same, a never-ending diet of salt pork, dried beef, beans, potatoes, turnips, and corn. After eating army food for nearly 3 years, Frank Carruth wrote to his sister, "I want Pa to be certain to buy wheat enough to do us plentifully, for if the war closes and I get to come home, I never intend to chew any more cornbread." Luxuries such as eggs, milk, butter, wheat flour, and sugar were scarce at the best of times and often absent for months. No wonder that one boy, R.O.B. Morrow, could write with such enthusiasm about this meal. "We are now permitted to get something to eat. I ran into a store, got hold of a tin washpan, drew it full of molasses, got a box of good Yankee crackers, sat down on the ground in a vacant lot, dipped the crackers into the molasses, and ate the best meal I ever had." Stores weren't always handy, especially in wilderness areas. At these times, soldiers could buy things from sutlers. Sutlers were not an official part of the military, but they were permitted to trail after troops and sell things like food, razor blades, paper, and thread. Settlers acquired these hard-to-come-by items directly from the manufacturers or through European sources. Often they bought stolen goods and then charged soldiers 2 or 3 times the original purchase price. At one point in the war, eggs were selling for $6 a dozen, and bacon cost $15 a pound. Settlers not only charged high prices, sometimes they would refuse to sell food to soldiers they did not know or did not like. Whenever this happened, the young soldiers would find another way to get a meal. Elisha Stockwell took great delight in outwitting one greedy settler. Ed saw him put a big sweet potato in one of the wagons, and on the way back he got that potato. It was so long he couldn't hide it in his haversack, so he put the haversack under his coat and in camp asked me if I could hide it. I said yes, made a hole in the middle of the fire and covered it with ashes and coals, and we waited till all had laid down to go to sleep. We dug it out. It was baked fine, and we had all we could eat that night and the next morning. How did Stockwell feel about eating the stolen food? Apparently not bad at all. That was the best as well as the biggest potato I ever saw. Whether it was in a letter home or a journal, food was probably the most written about topic. Soldiers were constantly waiting for food supplies to show up or commenting unhappily about their quality, quantity, and variety when they did arrive. At times like this, soldiers often resorted to foraging to supplement their disappointing meals. Foraging simply meant living off the land around them. At times, they might hunt deer or bear in the nearby forest, or gather nuts and berries. But these activities took a great deal of time, something a marching soldier did not have. Instead, soldiers had to take a more direct approach to finding a meal. They walked up to a farmer's house and offered to buy whatever food was available. If their request was refused, they would take what they wanted, sometimes at gunpoint. Both armies had strict rules against foraging, and those caught could find themselves in jail for anywhere from a week to a month. But threats of going to jail did not put a halt to foraging. In fact, when guards were set out at night, they were there to keep soldiers in camp as much as to watch for an enemy attack. Still, a hungry boy could always find a way through even the tightest security, as John Delaney makes clear. Another nightly occupation is to rob beehives, and not infrequently, when the chorus of religious hymns is ascending, parties return from a thieving expedition with hats filled with honeycomb. Finding food was a constant challenge for the boys in the Civil War, even when safely in camp. Imagine what Charles Knott must have felt after his company became lost in enemy territory and ran out of food. After they had wandered aimlessly for several days and barely escaped capture twice, their luck changed. They stumbled across a house in the woods. No smoke rises from the chimney. We halt. The sergeant enters the open door, comes back and reports it is just what we want, a deserted house. After finding corn for the horses, Knott did a quick survey of their newly found bounty. In the yard, he saw chickens, cows, sheep, and pigs. Inside the house, they discovered a jar of molasses, a bag of dried peaches, a haunch of smoked venison, and a barrel of black walnuts, as well as coffee beans and cornmeal. The food was gathered up, and after the horses had eaten, Knott and his friends continued their search for the army. That night, they pitched camp and prepared a truly luxurious meal for themselves. He picks up his story. Pluck the chickens and cut them up, mix some meal and water, and make corn dodgers as the Tennesseans do. There are the plates to bake on, and we can try baking it in the ashes. But the coffee, everybody looks forward to it. No matter if it is poor and weak, it is always the tired soldier's great restorative, his particular comfort. The chickens must be stewed in pans and roasted on sticks. For the Civil War soldier was always simple, if not downright plain. Few soldiers were skilled cooks, and even those who did know how to prepare food found themselves hampered by lack of herbs, spices, and other ingredients. A little salt and pepper might be the only things available to put on a meal. Even so, most boys seem to have found great comfort in any meal, no matter how humble. They were able to escape, even if only for an hour or so, from fighting and death that surrounded them. A meal was a frail link to their recollections of home and family and a better time. Charles Knott closes his recollections of foraging with these thoughts. In the course of a half an hour,